Hello everybody, I'm Peg Lorraine. I have the privilege today to sit with our Senator Jake Oliveira, who is going to talk to us about a number of issues related to the town and related to the state and a little bit related to our current federal situation, if you don't mind.
Absolutely.
But we are so appreciative of your time, and we'll try to be very efficient so we don't hold you for too long. I want to start on a local level. Budget season for Belchertown has been hard. It's been hard for a number of years, and it's only getting harder. So we have a number of questions for you. One revolves around the Chapter 70 funds. Chapter 70 funds are the funds provided by the state to the school districts. And we also want to talk about the Proposition 2.5 override, which is pending in Belchertown. We'll have two votes, one on the 19th of May and one at town meeting on the 31st of May. And how those two things are braided together is very complicated, and I know that. But you were talking earlier about a potential change in the formula for Chapter 70 funds. Maybe you could explain that. And then touch on the 2.5 override, and then I have a question or two for you about the override.
Absolutely, and Chapter 70 is really the reason I started getting involved with politics in general about 20 years ago. So in my hometown, Aleppo, I sat as a student member of the school committee, and I got active as a student because I saw the inequities in the funding formula that existed in the late 90s, early 2000s that hadn't been updated since ed reform in the early 1990s, and it really disadvantaged a lot of communities across Massachusetts, particularly lower income communities. And anytime we hit a little bit of a recession or an economic downturn, then a lot of times your funding from the state is in jeopardy a lot of times. And the lifeblood of every school district, of every community, is Chapter 70 funding. And when you look at a town like Belchertown, they receive over $14 million from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts in their Chapter 70 funding formula allocation. In addition to that, there are several other buckets of funding that go towards education that benefits towns like Belchertown. And then the other large bucket that goes directly to your municipalities, something called unrestricted local aid. That is very important when we talk about Proposition 2.5. But I think we should start kind of at the beginning, Chapter 70, and please give kind of the history of Chapter 70 and how today why it needs to be reformed to better reflect the educational system that we have in the 21st century.
Thank you.
Chapter 70 funding formula, it's been around for several decades now and is the lifeblood, and it's a complicated formula that was developed decades ago, but really took hold as Massachusetts went through something called education reform in the early 1990s. If you go to other states across the country, how they fund their education system is very different. Mostly it's funded at the local level by local property taxes, but it's done in an economy of scale. So look at Massachusetts. Massachusetts has 351 cities and towns, about 7 million people. We have over 300 school districts in Massachusetts. A similar state, Maryland, that has roughly 6.5 million people, just a little bit smaller than Massachusetts, has only 16 school districts. And they're all county-based, which means there's an economy of scale. And each state funds it differently. But Massachusetts has been one of the more generous states in utilizing state dollars going back to cities and towns and to school districts. And we're very proud of that because we pride ourselves on our education system.
We rank
number one in the country in education, partly due to the dollars that we invest at the state and the local level in our public schools. We have some of the highest percentages of students attending public schools out of any state in the country, and we are the first state in the country actually to require public schools dating back to the 1640s, right when we were just a colony. So education is embedded in our Commonwealth's Constitution. And in fact, the John Adams Constitution, developed in 1780, the longest serving constitution in the entire world, longer than the US Constitution, longer than any state, longer than any other nation in the world. We operate under that Constitution. That Constitution guarantees a free and adequate education to every person in Massachusetts. There have been several court cases over time that has sued the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to say that we weren't living up to what is in the Constitution written by John Adams. Several of those court cases have made their way into the development of the Chapter 70 funding formula. And how it works is it's based on the wealth of a community, so looking at that individual city or town or school district and seeing how much dollars they can levy through their local taxes to support education. They also factor in things like the level of poverty of the community. The higher the level of poverty, the more money that you get from the state under that funding formula. They look at things like special education costs. The more students that you have that require greater resources, that goes up under your funding formula. Things like benefits that you provide to your employees and the number of employees you have, that is factored into the funding formula that's been developed. So when the 1990s came and the grand bargain was struck, the bargain was struck between Massachusetts that there would be accountability from the state, and the state would come in with more dollars into the communities in order to support their educational needs. That funding formula hasn't really kept pace with changes that we've had in the way that we educate students. And so when you look at inflationary costs for education, it hovers around 4 to 5% a year. Special education costs, though, have more than doubled that percentage increase during that time period. And so in the around 2014, 2015, Massachusetts was engaged in another lawsuit saying that funding formula that was developed was disadvantaging our most neediest students in Massachusetts. Those are our students that live primarily in our lowest income cities and towns, places like Springfield and Chicopee and Holyoke here in Western Massachusetts. And so what the legislature did is they passed something called the Foundation Budget Review Commission. And this commission met and they looked at how we were funding education, and they made changes to that funding formula recommended to the legislature in around 2016, 2017. So in 2017, 2018, the legislature began working on revising that funding formula, and they passed something called the Student Opportunity Act. That Student Opportunity Act really placed an emphasis on those underfunded communities, those Springfields, those Chicopees, those Holyokes, and they changed the funding formula in 2019 to reflect that and set Massachusetts on a 7-year path through 7 budget cycles to fulfill that promise that they made in that Student Opportunity Act to raise dollars for communities that really were underfunded. And it's been enormously successful. In my state Senate district, I have 11 school districts. Mm-hmm. I have 12 communities, but 11 because one is a regional and they're combined together. The only 2 communities that are not facing the pressures that Belchertown is facing right now with funding their town services and educational services are Springfield and Chicopee because of that funding formula
because of
change.
That additional funding.
Because that change that they received on that 7-year path. Mm-hmm. We're on year 6 of that 7-year path, which means fiscal year 27, we're entering fiscal year 26, will be running the course of the Student Opportunity Act. Springfield, because of these increases in funding, has been able to be the first school district in all of Massachusetts to provide universal pre-K to every child. And that is something that is really important. Mm-hmm. The problem is that the funding formula, even though communities like Belchertown, my hometown of Ludlow, and the rest of my suburban and rural communities saw increases in Chapter 70 with the funding formula change, mm-hmm. they did not see the level of increases that our urban or gateway city school districts saw under this funding formula. And it's not working and not keeping pace with those special education costs and the cost to deliver an education and services to the students here. That's why I, along with a lot of my colleagues in Western Massachusetts and Central Massachusetts, have been advocating that we can't wait another 20 or 30 years before we crack open that funding formula. We need to start the work now, and we need to do it now because communities need relief. And so what we're working on with the administration is trying to push them to already begin the process of opening up that funding formula. There was something that we fought very hard, and I did as a school committee member, to actually put into statute that we can't wait 30 years to crack open that funding formula. We need to open it up after a decade or so to see how it's working, and we're right at that decade mark when we need to start doing it. The other big area of education where Belchertown is feeling the pressure, and many communities are in regards to special education services. As I said before, far outpacing the cost of delivering an education to students, an education, special education that families and children deserve within the community. But we need to find a better way of paying for it. The state has also another pot of funds called the Special Education Circuit Breaker that goes to reimburse school districts from the prior year on the extraordinary special education costs. So a district could have a student that could cost them per year to educate them, especially if they have to go out of district, $200,000-$300,000. And so what the Commonwealth does is it reimburses the district for anything beyond around $52,000 beyond what it costs to educate a student, and that comes back to the community in those costs. That is another area that needs to be the focus, I feel, of cracking open this Chapter 70 funding formula. That's why I've worked with school committee members, superintendents, the teachers unions, as well as many of my colleagues on a bill that's designed to target special education services to look at how the Commonwealth can better help school districts pay for these costs that are burdening them so much, but also that children and families rely on to get the educational services that they deserve. And so what my bill does is open up the funding formula, particularly on special education, and not just on Chapter 70, but also looking at those other pots of funds that go to school districts. And that is gaining a lot of traction. In fact, many Belchertown community members were at a Ways and Means hearing at UMass Amherst about a month ago, where Secretary Tutwiler, our Secretary of Education, as well as our educational commissioners were there. And I pressed them on making sure that they lead the charge on opening this funding formula. The school districts are at the brink. And that leads to where Belchertown is today. And, the Belchertown situation is really troubling, but it's not unique. Out of my 11 school districts, 9 are in a very similar situation, facing budget shortfalls, as well as potential layoffs to individuals, to teachers and folks that work within our schools that are simply draconian in nature. And so that has left Belchertown in a situation where they fall under something called Proposition 2.5.
Right.
Not every state has this. And so prior to the early 1980s, the town meeting could decide on a budget that's based on their needs. But when Proposition 2.5 was passed by the voters in 1980, it limits the levy increase in a given year to 2.5% without a vote by the community itself. And so that puts Belchertown and every community in a situation where they're faced with either raising taxes, their own taxes beyond that 2.5%, or cutting services.
Right.
And that puts Belchertown and many other communities in a difficult situation. But not every state has that. If you go to Connecticut, they don't have that. And their property taxes are much higher than Massachusetts. A lot of my southern part of my district borders Enfield and Somers and other communities. Right on the line. And you should see what they're paying in property taxes there in Connecticut. So there's a balance to be made. And I think property taxes, some of the worst ways that we fund our services, because they're not progressive, they are regressive, and they hit everybody regardless of their income. And if you're paying rent, you're hit by it. If you are owning a home, you're hit by it. So that's why I think it's important that the state play a greater role in helping out communities so they're not put into a situation where they're forced with a Proposition 2.5 override. But the problem is that any change to the Chapter 70 funding formula probably won't take place for another 1.5 to 2 years now, which leaves Belchertown in a really serious situation where they're faced with these increases. So the other issue is when you speak to superintendents, when you speak to town administrators, if the Chapter 70 funding formula is not reformed in a given fiscal year, where should the state be putting greater resources to help out communities? And we've heard from all of our superintendents, our town administrators, that the special ed circuit breaker is a place to put more dollars in, but the minimum per student aid per child that you get, the House of Representatives has already put in their budget well beyond the governor, doubling what the per pupil minimum cost is, from $75 per student increase to $150, which also is greater resources for Belchertown, but it's not going to solve the budget situation that the community finds itself in. The other area that I touched on briefly is something called unrestricted local aid. And unrestricted local aid is actually aid that comes from the state lottery. And as Proposition 2.5 was coming in the 1980s, the lottery was ramping up. And so in order to help out communities that were feeling that real pinch of Proposition 2.5 and not wanting to raise, they're not having, the votes in a community to raise beyond 2.5, they created something called unrestricted local aid, which is cash directly to a community to help out with services into the general fund to help out with the community in its entirety. And so Belchertown right now receives a little over $2 million in direct unrestricted local aid that is funded by the state lottery that goes here. That's another way in which the state can help with communities as they're facing budget shortfalls as well. So several pots of funds. The budget that Governor Healy put out, which Belchertown and most communities begin to base their budget on, that's really what it is. The House, which, to be perfectly honest, Governor presents her budget, the legislature takes a look at it, and then we throw it in the trash and we start from
scratch.
Well, most of the time. The legislature has the power of the purse strings, not the executive. She places an emphasis on areas in which she wants to invest in. We have our priorities as well, and for most of our legislators, including me and Representative Saunders, who represent this community, our emphasis is making sure that we can return as much money as possible back to the communities to stave off increases. And so the House put out their budget that included increases in those line items. We also had a supplemental budget that was passed on the House side and that the Senate will be taking up in a couple of weeks, that also lifts more dollars for special education circuit breaker and for other pots of money that Belchertown could get to help with educational services. So we are, completely focused on, number one, putting more money in those pots of funds that can help out Belchertown, and number two, more long-term, fixing the Chapter 70 funding formula so it helps out communities like Belchertown, and solving and fixing our special education
on a more or less permanent basis.
On a permanent basis, correct.
Because I know that's a conversation that we have every year, and I know that the school district probably receives something like 65% of the total budget of the town, and people find that unwieldy and difficult. And in your conversation about special education, while that's a terrific thing, there are families whose kids don't necessarily require IEPs or aids or anything, but their kids also need a free and appropriate public education. So this 2.5 override is dividing the town. I'm sure you can imagine in a lot of ways, because not only do we have residents whose income is fixed and who are looking at a tax increase they don't feel they can afford, we have families whose incomes won't accommodate or they will struggle to accommodate a tax increase. On the other hand, you have everyone who wants to support the future of Belchertown and the future of the Belchertown schools as well as the community as a whole, and they're at odds with one another. It's going to be a really difficult vote, and the first vote being on the ballot on May 19th. So that's coming up pretty quick on us, and it's
town meeting before that.
Town meeting. Town meeting is after.
It's after that.
Town meeting has been moved to May 31st.
To May 31st.
So the first vote will be May 19th, the ballot vote, and then the town meeting vote, assuming that it passes on May 19th. Will then include that increase, and it will still be. It's creating resentment, as I'm sure you can imagine. So we wanted your take on it.
And
that explanation.
Can I just mention something else? And so
Absolutely.
People come to us and say, why can't the state give more dollars right now? And so we're not like the federal government. Number one, we don't print money. We have to live within our means as a state as
Right.
well.
So you have
And
to
the pressure,
make the
so
money
it's
work
make the
everywhere.
money work within the income. So the majority of what the Commonwealth takes in for that bases our budget. For a community, it's property taxes. For the state, it's state income tax that people pay into, which is a much more progressive way of funding governmental services. But there are also other pockets of funds, capital gains taxes. Voters passed the Fair Share Amendment, the millionaire's tax, which goes to education and transportation. So that is actually the only area in our state budget that's growing, is actually the revenue coming from the Fair Share Amendment. And that's how we were able to put more money towards that chapter, towards the per pupil funding for Chapter 70, as well as special education circuit breaker because of that increase. But the big elephant in the room, you say, what would you say that Belchertown percent of their budget is spent on schools? 60?
I think it's
65%.
It might be a tad more because we have to
Yeah.
include the
Pathfinder, yeah.
assessment every year.
Any guess what's the number one budget item for the state?
No, unless it's education.
It's not. It's not even close. The number one that we spend out of our budget is healthcare. 55% of the state budget is spent on healthcare. And that has only increased over the last 30 years.
Mhm.
From 30 years ago, it's maybe about 30% of the budget, 40% of the budget. And so even as people might see their taxes increasing, they're probably saying to themselves, why don't we have enough money to pay for things that we want to invest in, like education and transportation? It's because healthcare is taking more of the pie each and every year. When we talk about inflationary increases, so our budget growth level for the state's budget is estimated to grow about, I think, around 4%, maybe a little bit less than 4%. Spending in healthcare grew close to 9%, and that's fixed. And that's something
Nothing can be avoided.
we can't,
You avoid
and
it,
this
right.
is where the federal government plays an important role, because so just when you look at the total state budget, it's around $62 billion. 55% of that is spent on healthcare. Within that healthcare realm, majority of that is spent on our Medicaid system, which is Mass Health. And Massachusetts not only is number one in education, we're also number one in healthcare. We have the highest percentage of residents that have health insurance and get education, that get healthcare services coming in. And the number of Massachusetts residents that rely on Medicaid, out of our 7 million residents, it's 2 million people. That's a significant number. And out of that 2 million, 1 million are children. And so you can't cut services in healthcare to children because it'll cost us in the long run,
Yes.
even more money. So until we find a way to better contain healthcare costs, and I'll tell you what some of the healthcare cost drivers are that's impacting us. Weight loss drugs, things like Wegovy and Ozempic,
yeah.
that a lot of people are on to control their weight. That is actually straining our healthcare system and is requiring those healthcare costs to go up. What we don't know is what that could potentially save us long term on things like diabetes,
Right.
heart disease, all the other weight-related issues that come to it. But we won't see that for a while longer. But we also don't know, on that same vein, what the long-term effect of these drugs have on the individual, and could cost us more in the long run. So those are some of the constraints that we're finding. But within that Medicaid line item, which is the largest of it, our Mass Health line item, $14 billion comes from the federal government in reimbursement from us. And when we hear our partners, or I'd say lack of a partner in the federal government, talking about peeling back
Cutting back.
Medicaid, that will have a ripple effect on everything that we do at the state level, because it is such a high percentage of our budget. And so this is where the federal piece plays in so strongly, is that cuts in Medicaid, cuts in Medicare, not only impact the state, but impacts the ability for the state to invest in things like education and transportation, which will further burden our cities and towns and put our communities in a tougher position.
At greater risk.
We are building our budgets on both the House and the Senate side because we don't know. There's so much uncertainty on business as usual. But
Right, exactly. That was one of
Yes.
our questions.
We're building it on business as
Can the state,
usual.
if the individuals are losing, or the towns are
Mhm.
losing, can the state help? Given the current federal situation, we don't
know.
know the answer to that.
And we're already seeing cuts to all sorts of other programs that are vital to people, whether you look at veterans. I was just with Congressman Neal in our Veterans Center in Ludlow. And I had a veteran service officer that was our South Hadley veteran service officer who took a job with the federal government.
Oh.
He was fired a couple months in by, Doge and these people that
Right.
are taking hatchets to the government. And at the same time, they're cutting inspectors generals within these departments that are designed to make sure that we prevent waste, fraud, and abuse. So we're taking a cleaver to vital functions of our government, then cutting out the watchdogs that are there to find the efficiencies.
Right.
So that has a trickle-down effect on people on the ground. It has a trickle-down effect to our states. It has a trickle-down effect to our communities. And so when we don't have a reliable federal partner in the White House, it puts states and it puts municipalities in really, really difficult positions with so much uncertainty. We talked about veterans before. There are cuts to farm programs right down the road, Red Fire Farm, that's in Granby. They were rebuilding their farms, losing funding for their farms that exist in Western Massachusetts. We look at federally funded childcare programs like Head Start.
Right.
They are facing funding shortfalls coming from the federal government. We're looking at one of the major employers for the town of Belchertown. Major employer is UMass. When you cut NIH research funding, those are jobs of people that live within this community and pay those taxes that go to fund our services. When those are cut, that has a ripple effect on our state and our communities and our unemployment rate here in Massachusetts. So we are approaching our budget with a very, very cautionary approach to
Sure,
it because of the uncertainty that we are facing from the federal government. Look at food services. You look at, part of how we have been able to provide free universal lunch to every child in Massachusetts is reimbursement we get from the feds and about $140, $150 million that the state chips in, so families and communities don't have to worry about because it saves them on the administrative side as well. So we need to find the funding in order to do that, but we don't print money like the federal government
Can't
does.
be sure
We
you're
have
gonna
to
get that,
live.
yeah.
We have to live within our means, and that's what places
Jake.
us in a difficult situation. The other thing that I want to say about municipal finance, which is actually a really good thing, but people have talked about this a lot. Massachusetts, during the pandemic and by strong budgeting, has been able to build our state reserves, something called the Rainy Day Fund.
Right, what
The
we
rainy
call
day stabilization, which a community calls it. For the state, we call it the Rainy Day Fund, and that was created in the 1990s. And prior to the pandemic, it was right around $2 billion. Now it's right around $9 billion. But the problem is that we have to determine when it's actually raining.
I was gonna say,
Yeah.
that sounds like so
Or-
much money until you realize.
Until you realize $14 billion,
everything is gonna be
if
affected.
something's cut in Medicaid, we can't make that up. And
No.
plus, those are one-time dollars. If we use it all in this fiscal year to bridge the gap that could be potentially coming, we won't have anything for
It's
next
a
year or
Band-Aid.
the year after, just like the stabilization. The other part of that rainy day fund that we have is that propels our bonding rating. And we have one of the strongest bonding ratings out of any state in the country. We're also one of the only states in the country that guarantees municipal bonds by the full faith and credit of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So when Belchertown goes out to bond to build a new school, or to build a new high school, or to bond for a project, you have the full faith and credit in the bonding rate of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts backing your municipal bonds, meaning that the cities and towns pay less when they go out for projects.
They get a
So
more favorable.
they get a more favorable interest
Is
rate.
that it?
So
Yes.
if we start rating the rainy day account, then
Yeah.
our bonding rating
Putting that
will
at
go
risk.
down, which means cities and towns will have higher costs when they go out to bond more. So we have to be really cautious when looking at that rainy day account because the ripple effect can not just impact our ability to pay for services, but also can impact our cities and towns if they want to go out to bond
If they
for a
need to,
project.
yes, if they need
For a
to.
project.
Oh, my Lord.
So it's all kind of tied together, and I know I'm
No,
speaking
you're
a lot
throwing
here,
a lot at me.
but
Yes,
it's
but
a lot
It's
that we're all trying to. So needless to say, would I love to fully fund Chapter 70 so it does it? Absolutely. But there are all these other pressures that are squeezing that pie of dollars for education and transportation and all the other needs smaller and smaller. But one of the big things that I am focused in on is containing those healthcare costs and looking at the long-term fiscal health of healthcare in Massachusetts so we can slow down that rate of inflation that we're seeing in healthcare, so we can better fund the services that we need to fund within our government.
Oh my goodness, well, in all that conversation, Jake, you've covered about everything I wanted to ask you. Only, if you got anything you can tell us that's positive.
There are a lot of positive things.
Okay, let's do that.
So a lot of positive things that we've had. I mean, Massachusetts, unlike other states, we're in a really strong position. We said before, we're number one in education. We're number one in healthcare. We're the number one state in the country to be a woman. We are one of the top states to start a business. These are all strong things that Massachusetts is proud to have. One area that we need to do some more investing in and we need to look at is transportation. We've done a lot to try to give more money to communities through Chapter 90. We talked a lot about Chapter 70. Chapter 90
is the roads.
The roads, culverts, sidewalks, all the things that communities get from the state government in order to help out. We have put in more pots of funding that would disproportionately help towns like Belchertown. So the Chapter 90 funding formula is kind of a three-legged stool, one based on population, miles of roadway, and employment. Western Massachusetts towns like Belchertown get hurt because they don't have the population that the eastern part has, don't have the employment that a lot of other communities that are larger have. So what we've tried to do on the Senate side, and the House has done it as well, is put more money on that third leg of the stool, on the miles of road, which disproportionately helps Belchertown because it's one of the largest communities and has a lot of state roads, has a lot of miles of roads. So it definitely helps it. So that's a good thing that we're growing right now. Also, last session, we had one of the most productive sessions in recent memory. We passed the largest working families tax cut out of any other state in the country, first time in 25 years, something called the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is giving more money to working people that are, working and struggling and trying to raise their family, but more money in child independent tax credits. We expanded the senior circuit breaker tax credit, which helps seniors stay within their homes. We reformed the estate tax, which was catching a lot of middle-class families when they were trying to sell their homes because the floor needed to be raised because assets were well beyond what they were 30 years ago when the estate tax was last changed. We also passed a major prescription drug bill last session that's going to be trying to contain those healthcare costs and putting caps on really the out-of-control costs that we see in prescription drugs. So for life-saving medicines for heart disease, diabetes, asthma, things that 90% of families rely on and individuals rely on, we cap the monthly supply of those drugs for name brand drugs at $25 per month and $0 for any generic brands. That's a game changer for seniors, that's a game changer for families that rely on these life-saving drugs. And also within that bill, there's something called PBMs, pharmaceutical benefit managers, which is kind of the middleman between the pharmaceuticals, the insurance, and the individual that is really seeing where a lot of these cost drivers are going up, and we're holding them accountable and giving state regulators the tools to actually regulate them in a better way so they're not jacking up the costs on people and pricing them out of the prescription drugs that they deserve. We also passed last session universal school lunch program that we talked about a few minutes ago. That's really important, not just for individuals, but it also saves school districts money because the administrative costs of administering a paid school lunch program is really costly to a school district. So it's not just the right thing to do, but it also can save the district money when you don't have to worry about tracking families down for money or having the pay system
or having the kids go
without it. That's an important part of it. Other thing we passed is universal community college, free community college for every Massachusetts resident. You don't have to worry about taking out exorbitant amount of loans if you want to go get a certificate to get a job within within Massachusetts. We also did in that same make universal ride-free regional transportation. So PVTA that goes up and down our roads here and serves some of our lowest income individuals, that's now universally free for.
So it's no longer just this, it was the region of the university, UMass, I know
UMass.
if think if the bus number ended in 3,
Yep.
the ride was free or something, but when she got to Northampton,
Yeah,
that
it
wasn't
changed.
true anymore.
Then you started to pay.
And so
So
now,
now, this is for just this year. I mean, we're looking at trying to make this permanent. Community college is more long-term permanent. Regional transportation is in a little different situation with it. We've also invested historically in early childhood education for childcare. We know one of the biggest cost drivers for families right now is paying, and it also prevents people from being enrolled and getting a job and staying in a job
Right.
if they have to stay home and
Because they
provide
don't
the
have
childcare.
childcare, right.
And they don't have the money to pay for it, and that their entire income would likely go towards childcare.
Yes.
We expanded something called C3 grants, and these C3 grants are designed in 2 ways. It upped the subsidies for families, so meaning if you're a family that makes under $125,000 a year, you can pretty much get universally free access to childcare in Massachusetts right now. And those C3 grants also are designed to raise the salaries of our
The childcare
childcare providers, which are paid very, very low wages. We have trouble attracting people into that profession because of it,
And
and that's what, and keeping them. And so, you know, we've been trying to do that. The other thing that we're looking to do in the future is to make universal pre-K universal for every school district in Massachusetts, not just for places like Springfield that experimented with that, which can help with our childcare issue, which allows more parents, more families to have more money in their pockets to start their lives.
having passed all these things, are they in effect now?
Many of them are in effect. So like free community college, in effect.
Is in
Free
effect
RTA, regional transportation, in effect now.
Okay.
Universal school lunch, in effect now. The prescription drug bill, it's being regulated and working on the regulations right now that are implementing it. A housing bill that we passed to try to generate more housing production to reduce the cost of housing, which, you know, for long-term Massachusetts, we're not losing our population. There's a misnomer that we're losing our wealthy population to states that are, you know, have much more favorable quote-unquote tax for people that are wealthy. We're not losing that. What we're losing right now are the 25 to 40-year-olds because they can't afford housing. And so we're trying to unlock more opportunity to build more housing, to rehabilitate our current housing stock, and also for those that rely on subsidized housing and senior housing, update the facility so they're not living in a situation where they have a very outdated, inefficient, and really difficult housing situation. So all that we're working on right now, and that's coming out as we work through as this legislation, as these
How to
large
make this
pieces of
all work.
legislation are passed.
How does
Correct.
that work? Okay, so I imagine that our housing authority is aware
Yes,
of
they
and
very much are.
watching these things, but I think that every community needs more affordable housing. Doesn't have to be subsidized,
No.
doesn't it? It's just that you're right.
Yeah.
Young people are really struggling. The
Mhm.
median house price, I think, in Belchertown is over $400,000 now, and we are considered to be a relatively affordable
Mhm.
community.
Yeah.
So housing is an issue for everybody.
Mhm.
Okay, so because we're watching the federal government sort of flail around right now and figure out what they're gonna cut, what they aren't gonna cut, is any of this at risk? The free regional transportation and the free community college, because the state is at risk
Mhm.
for losing some federal funding. And what kind of preparatory things are you guys doing in the face of that? Or can you do anything when you don't know what's happening?
I will say everything's at risk. Everything within our budget is at risk, including our cities and towns. That's at risk as well for their financial stability. So we talked about Medicare before. Medicaid.
Right.
Medicaid is not just, you know, health insurance that the federal government helps out. It's also reimbursement for school districts. So any services to that million Massachusetts children that are on Medicaid that are provided within the schools, things like nurse visits, visits to a school psychologist or a social worker, that's all reimbursed by the federal government and Medicaid as well. So school districts and communities could be further at risk by these cuts because they get funding from the federal government to provide services to the students within their schools as well. So what the state is trying to do, as best we can, we are trying to live up to our priorities, the things that we hold dear, things like education, transportation that we spoke about before. And we're also trying to identify bills that will insulate us from any type of federal incursion as well. So I chair this session, the Labor and Workforce Development Committee. So looking at protections of workers that might be peeled back at the federal level, making sure that we have proper state level protections as well that can insulate us against federal changes that might impact the ability for people to work and live. One of the big issues that I'm very concerned about this cycle, and this is something that my committee is going to try to tackle this section, is the Unemployment Trust Fund. Unemployment Trust Fund is paid by employers and creates a pool of dollars. Trust fund is set to run out of money by 2028 in Massachusetts. We need to find, and because that assessment on employers hasn't been changed in many decades. It's a little outdated, so we need to find a better way of providing unemployment insurance to folks. Majority of people at some point in their life, it could be for 1 week, 2 weeks, a month, 3 months, few months, rely on unemployment insurance. Growing up, both my parents did at some point during their lives, going through recessions and changing careers. So families rely on this. We need to find a sustainable way of funding our unemployment trust fund so people continue to have the ability to live without fear of going into crippling debt or falling into poverty if they lose their job. So those are some things that I'm particularly focused in on this session as well. And the federal government plays a role in that on the regulatory side, and we're watching that as well. So needless to say, everything is intertwined, and we don't have a lot of answers yet because we don't know what's coming down. We've already seen cuts come to certain programs that are within the federal government's purview, but we are told that there is more to come. What's most troubling to me are, the funding is one thing, and those are people's lives. It's the fear that's being instilled in a lot of people. Whether you're a member of the trans community, whether you're an immigrant that's here, there's a lot of fear. Legal or illegal. There is a lot of fear that is being sowed into people and people's lives because of actions and rhetoric taken at the federal level. And the trade war that has been ignited right now, people don't, I think, understand that we still have a significant manufacturing base here in Western Massachusetts. I have many manufacturers that rely on importing products from Canada, from China, from other areas. Imports tariffs go up, that will cripple their business and will result in likely unemployment or higher prices for individuals out here. This is something that is extraordinarily troubling to our economy.
Sure.
But look at what the federal government is targeting. They're targeting education institutions. They're targeting healthcare. What are the two main industries of Massachusetts? Education and healthcare. So that is something that we're trying to grapple with as well as a state of how we can better insulate ourselves from these changes. I can tell you though that, I have been out meeting with people that have been impacted by these federal government kind of changes and fear that they're instilling. And the fear is legitimate and it's terrifying. And I just want people to know that your state, your Commonwealth, your legislators stand with you. We are here to support you. We are here to listen to your concerns. We're here to raise you up. And we're also here to do what we can in order to insulate ourselves from what is going on in the federal government.
I think that's probably the most reassuring thing, that you are looking at some kind of insulation for the state. And I know that there isn't, again, as you said, the uncertainties are enormous, and I think the people in this community are they are feeling the same concerns and the same fears. And the impulse that you have to just get out in the street and protest is not enough. This is the way it feels to me as I read all of this political stuff, all the people who are trying to keep us informed about what's happening, the lawsuits, the Supreme Court, the law firms, the universities. The attacks are pretty much endless, and it's wearing people down. So I was saying to someone this morning, I give myself about 90 minutes a day to read the Contrarian and Tangle and Bulwark and all of these sites that are in theory trying to keep us informed, but I can't tolerate much more than that 90 minutes. And I think a lot of people are feeling that way, that you're overwhelmed and it's all bad news. And so anything positive that you can bring to us, I think we're very grateful for that. And we're grateful for your time, of course, because I know how busy you are. So is there anything else you want to tell Belchertown before we say thank you very much and send you on your way to whatever comes next?
It is an honor to represent this community. I represented, 3/4 of it in the House for one term, this community, and I love it. I really do. And I've said, this is a community where rural Massachusetts meets, suburban Massachusetts. It is one of the fastest growing communities in all of Western Massachusetts.
Still, and for decades.
Still for decades. It is a very cool and interesting community because you have working farms, you have suburban neighborhoods, you have the proximity to the Massachusetts Turnpike, proximity to the 5 colleges, you have the proximities to some incredible open spaces, including the Quabbin Reservoir that's behind us over here, and it's just such a wonderful community to represent. Even though I don't live here, I live right down the road in Ludlow. There are a lot of Ludlow people that have moved to Belchertown because they want to feel how Ludlow was 40 years ago or 30 years ago, and we continue to see that. But I love the ability to represent it. There's nothing better than going to, whether it's an event on the Belchertown Common and then looking around in the fall and saying this could be out of a Norman Rockwell postcard, because it is just that beautiful. And
it does feel that way. It's a beautiful.
It really
beautiful
is, and it makes it wonderful. People, sometimes will ask me, you represent many communities, and I do. I have a very decentralized district. Belchertown is about 10% of my district. Each one of my communities is roughly about 10%.
You have 11?
Yeah, I have 12 communities.
12.
And, even though I represent Springfield and Chicopee, I only represent about 17,000 in each one of those communities.
Oh, I see.
So they're all roughly around the same size as Belchertown.
That's interesting.
And so my largest community is actually Ludlow at 21,000. That's only 11% of my district. So my district is very spread out and has, they're all roughly, most of the communities are roughly equal in size to one another. And so I try to spend as much time as I possibly can. But if you don't see me at an event, it's not because I don't want to be there. It's really want to be there, but I have 11 other communities that are very similar in size that usually have events going on at the same time. But I always try to make a priority to Belchertown because it does play a special, it has a special place in my heart, given that I represented in the House beforehand as well.
It's beautiful. It's getting more beautiful. I don't know if you got a chance to go over and see the paint party at the transfer station.
I haven't yet.
Did you?
I haven't.
So we're doing a lot.
And we're doing some great things with the skate school too. When I was a House member, taking down some of the properties and structures that need to be taken down, like the power plant that has been staying there for a little while.
It's finally happening.
It's finally happening. And we've been working with the administration, bringing people out here, try to get them, and we continue to put on the state's radar screen the number of state properties that are here, and also to tell the story, the long history that Belchertown has with the disability community, and ways in which we can better support businesses and industry that's coming in here and revitalizing, and also preserving the open space that's essential for this.
You brought a bunch of visitors to the UMass Orchard too.
I did. Brought the Senate there, brought about 20 of my colleagues up there, and they really enjoyed it.
They were blown away.
They were.
By how
not just by the wind down the hill,
is.
but they were very
gorgeous.
impressed. It's just absolutely gorgeous.
Well, we're happy to have you, so I'm happy that you're happy to have us. So I think we're going to try to meet with Representative Saunders in the next month or so. He wants to wait till after budget season.
I don't blame him. He's an anchor. With the Senate, the benefit of the Senate is that we're later on in the budget cycle, so we start up in late May with our budget. So. He's
working
in the
on that
middle.
now. But he will be with us sometime soon, and we hope to see both of you on a regular basis. I'm so grateful for your time because I know you're on the run all the time. So we say thank you very much. We say thank you to the town for watching, and that's it for our Jake Oliveira Legislator's Report.